through broken stones and sun-scorched ruins. The wind howls across empty courtyards once alive with traders, prayers, and empire. In the distance, a different sound. Modern now, explosions, distant gunfire, sirens, Gaza, Damascus, Baghdad. Names that echo not only through today's headlines but through the graveyards of history. And if you trace that echo far enough back, it doesn't lead you to 1948. It doesn't begin with oil pipelines or religious dogma or terrorism. It begins in 1916 with a war waged in Europe and a secret deal drafted behind closed doors. The war to end all wars didn't end anything in the Middle East. It detonated something new. As empires collapsed and old powers fell, foreign diplomats took to their maps, not with understanding or consultation, but with rulers and red ink. With pens, promises, and ambition, they carved invisible lines across ancient lands. Lines that cut through tribes, languages, and centuries of shared history. These weren't borders, they were fractures. And those fractures would bleed for generations. Today's chaos didn't rise from nothing. It was built, line by line, lie by lie. Syria's suffering, Iraq's collapse, the stateless dreams of the Kurds, the enduring agony of Palestine. These are not isolated crises. They are the aftershocks of decisions made in the aftermath of World War I, when Britain and France reshaped a region they neither belonged to nor understood. But how did it happen? How did a European war and a few secret deals redraw the Middle East, create nations, break trust, and ignite a fire still burning today? That's the story we're about to tell. One of betrayal, ambition, and the long shadows cast by lines drawn in secret. Because if you want to understand the Middle East today, you must first go back to the moment its future was stolen.
For over 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the world's most formidable powers, stretching across continents and encompassing an extraordinary range of peoples, cultures, and religions. From the snow-covered hills of the Balkans to the scorching deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, it ruled over what is now Turkey, Greece, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, parts of Saudi Arabia, and beyond. Its reach was vast, but its strength lay not only in territory, it lay in the way it managed its diversity. Unlike many empires that sought cultural erasure, the Ottomans created a system that allowed many identities to survive under one political umbrella. This system was known as the millet system, a model of governance that granted the religious and ethnic communities the right to manage their own affairs. Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Jews, Sunni, and Shia Muslims all lived within the empire, each with their own laws, leaders, and languages, paying taxes to the Sultan but maintaining a degree of autonomy. While far from perfect or equal, the millet system kept a kind of uneasy peace. It allowed synagogues to stand beside mosques, and it kept sectarian violence in check for generations. This made the Ottoman Empire not just a state, but a mosaic, a rare balance of pluralism held together by imperial will and Islamic legitimacy. But by the early 1900s, the cracks in that balance were widening. Internally, the empire was losing grip. Corruption festered in provincial governments. Nationalist movements were growing. Arab intellectuals, Kurdish leaders, Armenian activists, and Balkan revolutionaries were all demanding greater rights, autonomy, or full independence. The rise of the Young Turks, a secular nationalist reform movement, created friction with traditionalists and ethnic minorities. The empire's once celebrated flexibility was hardening into brutal resistance. Externally, the vultures were circling. European powers, chiefly Britain, France, and Russia, viewed the Ottoman decline as an opportunity. To them, the empire was the sick man of Europe, and its death was not a tragedy but a geopolitical windfall. The Middle East particularly was becoming more valuable than ever. Not only did it command holy cities like Mecca and Jerusalem, but it sat at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Control over these lands meant access to trade routes, maritime choke points like the Suez Canal, and, crucially, emerging oil reserves in Persia and Mesopotamia. As the empire weakened, foreign influence grew. British agents courted Arab tribal leaders. French missionaries gained influence in Lebanon and Syria. German military advisors embedded themselves in Ottoman ranks. The empire became a chessboard where outside powers moved pieces according to their own ambitions, not local needs. Then came 1914. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo sparked a global fire. The Ottoman Empire, hoping to reclaim strength and resist further disintegration, entered World War I on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. It was a fateful decision. The war would become the final blow to an already fragile empire. What began as a gamble to preserve sovereignty quickly turned into a death spiral. The Ottomans found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, from the Russian Caucasus to the British in Egypt, from the Balkan edges to the Persian frontier. As troops bled and supplies vanished, the empire's internal fractures exploded. Arab nationalists began to see the war as a moment to break free. Ethnic tensions turned violent. The ancient mosaic started to shatter. And yet, even in decline, the empire still held much of the Middle East. Damascus, Baghdad, Jerusalem. These cities remained under Ottoman rule, but not for long. The stage was set for betrayal, for promises whispered in the desert and borders sketched in European boardrooms. The Ottomans ruled for centuries, but by 1914, their empire was a colossus with broken legs, and the vultures were circling. When World War I erupted in Europe, the Middle East was drawn into the conflict not by choice, but by the weight of empire. The Ottoman Empire, seeing an alliance with Britain and France as a threat to its survival, chose to side with Germany and the Central Powers. It was a desperate gamble. A final attempt to reclaim influence, protect its territories, and resist the growing pressure from colonial wolves at the door. But in joining the war, the Ottomans opened their lands to an entirely new kind of invasion. One not just of soldiers, but of secret promises, tribal rebellions, and a new breed of imperial strategists. For the British, the war presented more than just a chance to defeat an enemy. It offered the opportunity to reshape the Middle East. They knew that Ottoman control over Arab lands was fragile, held together more by tradition and fear than by loyalty. And so, behind enemy lines, they began to build an alliance not with armies but with dreams. They reached out to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, guardian of Islam's holiest cities, and a respected leader among Arab tribes. In a series of secret letters, British officials promised him independence for a vast Arab kingdom stretching from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula if he would lead an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Sharif Hussein agreed. In 1916, his sons, Faisal and Abdullah, led the uprising, rallying tribal fighters under a banner of Arab liberation. Riding alongside them was a British officer whose myth would soon eclipse his mission, T.E. Lawrence. Fluent in Arabic, dressed in tribal robes, Lawrence was more than a soldier. He was a storyteller, a symbol of British partnership, and eventually a legend. Together, they carried out guerrilla attacks against Ottoman railways, forts, and outposts, disrupting supply lines and morale. The Arab Revolt was born, and it was fueled by hope, courage, and deception. While swords clashed in the deserts, pens in London were quietly rewriting the region's fate. British promises of Arab independence were being made with one hand, while the other hand was drafting a secret agreement with France. That deal, Sykes-Picot, would soon divide the very lands Britain had promised to liberate. But those marching through the sand didn't know that yet. To the Arab fighters, this was a righteous war, a holy struggle to free their lands, not just from Ottoman control, but from the shadow of European domination. They believed the future was theirs. On the battlefield, the desert became both weapon and shield. Lawrence and the Arab forces moved with the landscape, striking fast, vanishing faster. Their victories were real, their sacrifices enormous. Cities like Aqaba fell and Ottoman garrisons were thrown into disarray. But with each success, the illusion of partnership grew deeper. Behind the scenes, Arab aspirations were being quietly erased in favor of imperial strategy. The British didn't see the Arab Revolt as a path to freedom. They saw it as leverage, boots they didn't have to place on the ground. As Ottoman control weakened, the future of the Middle East began to fracture in the hands of outsiders. Arab lands were not being prepared for self-rule. They were being measured, divided and assigned to new masters. And the same British officials who toasted Arab bravery in one room signed secret treaties against them in another. This was not just betrayal, it was orchestration. The promises of independence were not flawed, they were false. The Arab Revolt, though brave and real, was built on sand layered over lies. And as the war neared its end, the fighters who believed they were shaping their future would discover they had only cleared the path for new empires to rise. To fight the Turks, Britain promised the Arabs freedom. But even as swords clashed in the sand, pens in London were rewriting the future behind their backs. In May of 1916, as blood soaked the sands of Arabia and Ottoman control weakened by the day, two men sat in secret and drew lines across a land they did not own. Mark Sykes of Britain and Francois-Georges Picot of France weren't generals or diplomats on the ground. They were politicians. Imperial architects with maps in front of them, slicing through the Arab world with rulers and red ink. The result of their quiet negotiations was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a plan that would shape the future of the Middle East, not with justice or consent, but with geometry and ambition. According to the agreement, France would control the northern zone, modern-day Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would take the south, roughly Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. These zones of control weren't about culture or religion. They weren't drawn with any respect to tribal borders, ethnic ties, or linguistic realities. These were zones of interest: economic, strategic, and imperial. The region's people were not consulted. Their aspirations, especially those being stoked by Britain's promises to Arab leaders, were treated as bargaining chips. What made Sykes-Picot even more insidious was that it directly contradicted the commitments Britain had made to Sharif Hussein and the Arab Revolt. Just months after promising a free and united Arab kingdom, British officials were dividing that very land with the French, and they weren't done. Around the same time, another secret promise was taking shape, one that would further complicate the post-war landscape: the Balfour Declaration. But for now, the focus remained on how to split the Ottoman corps. Russia, Britain's other wartime ally, was initially informed of the plan and offered control over Istanbul and parts of eastern Anatolia. But after the Russian Revolution in 1917, those ambitions collapsed. Ironically, it was the Bolsheviks who leaked the Sykes-Picot documents to the world. When the agreement was made public, it confirmed what many Arab leaders had begun to suspect, that the war for independence was being manipulated from afar. The outrage was immediate. Arab nationalists who had bled for British promises now saw them for what they were: tools of empire, cloaked in the language of liberation. Lawrence himself, once a hero of the Arab cause, was devastated. He had believed in the revolt, had grown close to Faisal, and had hoped Britain would keep its word. But London had no intention of fulfilling dreams. It had interests to protect. The Sykes-Picot Agreement didn't just draw borders. It
drew fault lines, lines that would harden into national boundaries, that would pit neighbors against each other, and that would fracture communities bound by centuries of coexistence. These artificial borders forced together Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, Christians, and others into new nations that had no shared history of statehood. It separated tribes and joined rivals. It transformed the Middle East into a ticking clock, set to explode when imperial power withdrew, and explode it would. Lines were drawn with the ruler, ignoring tribes, tongues, and faiths. These weren't borders, they were fractures. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was never about freedom. It was about securing ports, oil routes, and influence. It was about deciding who would inherit the Ottoman Empire's wealth, not how to build a new world, but how to divide the old one. And in doing so, it betrayed not only the Arabs, but the very idea of self-determination. The legacy of Sykes-Picot still haunts the region. In Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, borders created in boardrooms have become battlefields. And as warlords, militias, and radical groups rise, many still point to 1916. Not as ancient history, but as the moment the fire was lit. A fire that still burns.
While Britain and France were slicing up the Arab world in secret, another promise was being drafted. One that would ignite another fire and plant the roots of a conflict that continues to shape headlines a century later. In 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued a short letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. It was only 67 words long, but it carried the weight of empires. It declared Britain's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This was the Balfour Declaration, and it would change everything. The declaration was a diplomatic masterstroke for the Zionist movement, which had been growing in strength across Europe. After centuries of persecution and rising anti-Semitism, many Jewish leaders dreamed of a homeland where Jews could live in security and dignity. Palestine, the ancient land of Jewish history and scripture, became the chosen site for that dream. For Zionists, the Balfour Declaration was validation, a promise that the most powerful empire on earth supported their cause. But Palestine was not empty. It was home to over 500,000 Arabs, Muslims, and Christians who had lived there for generations. They were farmers, traders, clerics, and community leaders. They had not been consulted. They had been promised something else. Because just a year earlier, the British had implied to Sharif Hussein that Palestine would be part of the new Arab kingdom. Now, the same land had been promised again to a different people for a different purpose. The contradiction was staggering. Britain had pledged independence to the Arabs, colonial influence to the French, and a national home to the Jews, all in overlapping territories. This wasn't diplomacy. It was duplicity. And the consequences would be catastrophic. As Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, tensions between Jewish settlers and the local Arab population began to rise. Protests turned into riots. Communities that had once coexisted under Ottoman rule now viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. Each group felt entitled, betrayed, and increasingly determined to fight for control of the land. What began as competing dreams would soon become competing claims, and then open conflict. The British, caught between their promises and their ambitions, tried to manage the situation through vague mandates and shifting policies. But the damage had already been done. Trust had been broken. And in its place grew anger, fear, and a sense of existential threat on both sides. To one side, a homeland. To the other, betrayal. The seeds of one of the world's longest running conflicts were being sown. The Balfour Declaration wasn't just a letter. It was a fuse, one that would eventually ignite a conflict far larger than any of its authors imagined. It gave hope to a people in exile, yes, but it also displaced another. It created a promise that two peoples could not share without collision. And it made Britain the midwife of a future that would deliver bloodshed, borders, and generations of mistrust. To this day, the Declaration remains one of the most contested documents in Middle Eastern history. For many Jews, it marked the beginning of a journey home. For many Palestinians, it marked the beginning of dispossession. The legacy of Balfour is not just historical, it is alive, pulsing through the streets of Jerusalem, the refugee camps of Gaza, the checkpoints of the West Bank. And yet, when it was written, it was just another move in a much larger imperial game. A game in which human lives were often secondary to strategy. Another signature, another promise, another line drawn on a map with no regard for the people who lived beneath it. As the dust of war began to settle in 1918, the Ottoman Empire lay in ruins and the Middle East stood exposed. Its future not determined by the people who lived there, but by the imperial victors who emerged from the ashes of World War I. Britain and France, emboldened by the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the military dominance, moved quickly to reshape the region. But this wasn't reconstruction. It was rebranding. Empires didn't come with chains this time. They came with mandates, maps, and oil contracts. They called it liberation. But what followed was occupation under another name. Oil was now at the center of everything. The British had already discovered oil in Persia, and they knew the vast lands of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, were rich with untapped reserves. Securing access to this resource became a top priority. The League of Nations, under the guise of promoting peace and development, granted Britain and France control over former Ottoman territories. These were called mandates, but they were colonial protectorates in all but name. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. To make this new order appear legitimate, puppet kings were installed. In Iraq, the British placed Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein, and a leader of the Arab Revolt, on the throne. In Transjordan, his brother Abdullah was given a crown. These men were figureheads, Arab rulers dressed in royal robes but serving at the pleasure of London. The newly created borders ignored centuries of tribal, ethnic, and religious history. Sunni, Shia, Kurds, and Christians were bundled into new nations with no shared sense of identity. Unity was replaced with fragility, and these manufactured states became powder kegs. In Syria, the French faced fierce resistance. The 1925 to 1927 Great Syrian Revolt brought together Druze, Sunni, and nationalist forces in a violent uprising against French rule. Towns were bombed, thousands were killed. But the message was clear. This was no grateful liberation. It was colonialism. Plain and brutal. In Iraq, the story was much the same. The 1920 Iraqi revolt saw tribes unite across religious and ethnic lines to oppose British control. What began as peaceful protest turned into a full-scale rebellion with brutal crackdowns and thousands of casualties. The land might have changed hands, but the fight had not ended. In Palestine, tensions mounted between Jewish immigrants and Arab inhabitants. Britain, caught between the promises of the Balfour Declaration and the rising Arab opposition, tried to balance both sides and satisfied neither. Violent clashes erupted. The seeds of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had already taken root, fertilized by betrayal and broken promises. These new states, artificial, unstable, and imposed from above, were soaked in oil and built on violence. They weren't born of revolution or national consensus. They were drafted in foreign offices, shaped by economic interests, and held together by colonial force. And yet, these borders would define the Middle East for the next century. Empires didn't just draw borders. They laid pipelines, propped up rulers, and wrapped it all in the language of freedom. The legacy of this era is still visible today. The fractured identities, the contested lands, the sectarian rifts, they all stem from this moment. The modern Middle East was not built on foundations of peace or autonomy. It was built on a blueprint of convenience for empires that no longer exist. But the nations they created remain, some thriving under fragile stability, others unraveling in fire. From the rise of Saudi Arabia under Ibn Saud to the artificial unification of Iraq, from Lebanon's precarious sectarian system to Syria's long descent into civil war, each story begins here in the aftermath of World War I. These weren't just the new nations. They were test cases in empire management, designed for control, not coherence. And all of it, every crown, every pipeline, every flag, was born not from revolution, but from the remnants of a war that was supposed to end all wars. In reality, it only began a new kind of battle, one of identity, autonomy, and survival in a landscape drawn by outsiders, soaked in oil and wrapped in lies. The war was over. The treaties were signed. The empires that had once claimed to rule in the name of civilization now stood triumphant, with new flags flying over ancient cities. Kings were crowned, maps redrawn, and mandates issued under the illusion of order. But beneath the surface, nothing had truly ended. In many ways, the fire had only just begun. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire created a vacuum, not just of power, but of meaning. The people of the Middle East, promised freedom, instead woke up in countries they had never voted for, led by rulers chosen in European capitals, bound by borders that cut through their histories like knives. They were no longer citizens of a vast, familiar empire. They were suddenly Jordanians, Iraqis, Syrians, Palestinians, names they had never called themselves before. Nations that existed more on paper than in hearts. With every uprising and protest that followed, from the Iraqi revolt of 1920 to the Syrian resistance against the French, it became clear. These were not new beginnings. They were inheritances of betrayal. The resistance wasn't just political, it was existential. It was a refusal to be defined by foreign lines and foreign laws. It was the beginning of Arab nationalism, of pan-Islamism, of dreams to reclaim identity on their own terms. Violent resistance flared across the region. British and French forces cracked down with brutal efficiency. But the people were not fooled. They had seen what promises meant. They had lived through the cost of trusting empires. And what was left in the ashes wasn't peace. It was a memory. A memory of how the future had been stolen, repackaged, and sold back to them with the new flags and old chains. The guns of Europe had gone quiet. But the fire in the Middle East had only begun to burn.
These weren't just treaties, they were time bombs. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the British and French mandates, these weren't the end of war in the Middle East. They were its transformation. Colonial armies may have left decades ago, but the consequences of their decisions remain stitched into the soil. The borders drawn in secret have become fault lines. The promises made and broken still echo in every protest, every airstrike, every shattered ceasefire. ISIS rejected Sykes-Picot borders not just as a slogan, but as a battle cry. The Syrian civil war, the enduring Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iraq's fragmentation, Lebanon's sectarian paralysis, these are not a disconnected crisis. They are the legacy of a century-old betrayal. They are what happens when identities are ignored, when history is rewritten, when land is divided without listening to the lives that dwell upon it. Understanding 1916 means understanding 2024. It means realizing that the chaos we see today did not begin with terrorism or dictators or modern geopolitics. It began with men in quiet rooms, drawing lines on maps they didn't have to live inside. It began with empire dressed as liberation, with oil deals disguised as diplomacy, with a war that redrew the world and redrew the lives of millions who never asked for it. So what do we do with this knowledge? We remember not just the facts, but the patterns, not just the borders, but the betrayals behind them. Because until we understand how the past was carved into the present, we will keep mistaking explosions for origins and consequences for causes. If this story opened your eyes, share it. Leave a comment below. How should history be remembered, and who should be allowed to draw the future? Because maps may fade, but memory does not. And the lines drawn in 1916 still shape who lives and who dies. In the Middle East today, the war was over, the treaties signed, and the maps redrawn. But the story didn't end in 1918. The lines carved into the Middle East during World War I were not just political, they were prophetic. They set into motion forces that would take decades to erupt. Some fires smoldered slowly, building over time, only to explode later with far greater fury. To truly understand the inheritance of empire, we must look just beyond those original borders, to two nations whose modern identities were also forged in the shadows of World War I, Iran and Israel. Though Iran, then known as Persia, was never colonized in the traditional sense, it was not spared from imperial reach. During and after the war, British forces occupied parts of the country, citing the threat of German influence. But their deeper interest was clear. Oil. Discovered in 1908, Iran's vast reserves had already drawn the British into a controlling stake through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. In the post-war years, as Britain expanded its hold on oil-rich Iraq, it also tightened its grip on Iranian resources. What followed was a pattern that would define Iran's modern century: foreign interference, economic exploitation, and rising nationalist anger. These early seeds would later grow into the oil nationalization crisis of the 1950s and the revolution of 1979. Israel, meanwhile, began as a promise on paper, the Balfour Declaration, but it became a state through blood and struggle. After World War I, Palestine came under British control, and Jewish immigration steadily increased, fueled by both hope and necessity as anti-Semitism surged across Europe. Tensions with Palestinian Arabs escalated, erupting into riots, rebellions, and full-scale violence. The British, caught in a web of their own making, eventually withdrew in 1948. That same year, the State of Israel was born, immediately triggering a regional war with surrounding Arab nations. The conflict that began with a letter during the Great War had now taken the form of a nation and a battlefield. Iran and Israel, though very different in history and ideology, both carried the long echo of World War I. One shaped by oil, the other by promise. One manipulated into dependency, the other born from diplomatic contradiction. Both remain central players in the modern Middle East, and both, in their own way, are children of the empire that died and the empires that came to replace it. This is the inheritance of 1916, not just in borders, but in battles, not just in maps, but in memory. The war may have ended, but the lines it drew and the lives it changed are still very much alive.